Okay, hello everyone. I'm Gaylene Rogers Lonergan, the managing partner of the Lonergan Law Firm here in Dallas. And this is our podcast called Legal Answers Just for Real Estate. And today we're joined by Joe Umberger, who is a marketing professional. And we are going to discuss some frequent title issues that arise in connection with real estate closings. Thank you for joining us, Joe.
Great, thanks for having me. So, Gaylene, what is the number one thing that purchasers of real estate need to be aware of in connection with their real estate closings?
Okay, well, the main thing is before they even get to the closing, the most important thing is to make sure they know what their contract says. Make sure they understand everything that's stated in that contract, because that's they're gonna be bound by when it gets time for closing. They shouldn't rely on third parties. Read the contract through and through, every word. And then if there's anything they don't understand, they really need to speak to a professional that can help them with that. And I believe an attorney would be the best person to speak to, because we can get right down to what the nitty-gritty is. So if if you have any doubt, if a buyer has any doubts, they should always contact an attorney to go over it with them.
Well, recently my husband and I bought a house and we brought you the contract to review.
Right.
So that was a big help to us because it relieved me of a lot of uncertainty, because
Right.
that's not my area of expertise. So thank you
Right.
for helping
Yeah,
us with that.
most people they only buy real estate fairly infrequently.
Right.
And so they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So what should a buyer expect to receive from the title company or the seller once the contract is signed?
Okay, so once the contract is signed, it gets sent to a title company who will be the settlement agent, who will handle all the funds, handle making sure the title is cleared and whatnot. And the first thing they do is they order from a production center a search of the title records. And then that comes back from that production center in the form of something called a commitment for title insurance. And that is a document that really provides an outline of everything regarding the title to the property, who the current owner is, what the interest in the property is, what the legal description of the property is, what items are affecting the property right now, and what items should be cleared in order to have good title at the time that they close. So the commitment is really, well, I'll go through that in just a minute. The other thing that you need to make sure you get is a survey. A survey is a picture of a piece of property that you're buying that is prepared by a registered professional surveyor. It shows the improvements, it shows the easements, it shows anything physical that affects the property. And you can learn a lot from that, and you can see there may be some issues such as encroachments. A house built over a building line is not a good thing. It's not insurmountable, but it's not a good thing, such as that.
Okay. What about issues regarding the status of tax payments on the property? Are there issues that can arise there?
Taxes are probably the most frequent title claims that arise with title on closings. They're always a big issue. The first thing that the title company settlement agent will do is order from a third party something called a tax certificate that shows what the current status is on the tax payment on the property. It will show what exemptions affect the property, such as a homestead exemption. And then that's something that actually, my suggestion is every buyer asks for a copy of that. They rarely get offered that up front, but you certainly should ask for it. Now, the major issues that I've seen arise on taxes a lot of times relate to over 65 sellers. being over 65 myself, I know the over 65 exemption that our government gives us is significant. So the taxes for anyone over 65 that has applied for that exemption, they get a huge discount on their taxes. But if a seller is over 65 and a buyer is under 65, the buyer is not entitled to that exemption. So there's a tug right there about how you're going to prorate the taxes. In other words, the part of the year that the seller owns it and the part of the year that the buyer owns it, which basis are you going to prorate? The lower basis or the higher one? But more than importantly than that is I've seen where people buy, particularly investors, buy properties from the children or the heirs of a deceased over 65 person. Okay, so on that, you're anyone over 65 is entitled to the exemption, but the minute that the person passes away, that exemption, the entitlement to that exemption goes away. The problem is the tax jurisdictions, they have no way of knowing that that person has passed away until something is filed of record. And a lot of times heirs or children will sit there and own the property, sometimes even for years, okay, and just continue to pay the then current rate at over 65, even though they weren't entitled to it, okay? So what happens then is we come to closing, and if the title settlement agent doesn't really know what he or she is doing, and I've seen that numerous times, they just deal with the current tax situation. Well, then the deed from this closing gets recorded, and at that point there either has to be some sort of affidavit of heirship or probate recorded that shows the date that the person who did have the exemption passed away. It may take a few months, but the tax jurisdiction will eventually go back, that'll hit them, and they'll go back and they'll reassess the property back to the date that the person passed away, and then send the buyer, the current owner of the property, a new bill for the difference.
A surprise bill.
A surprise bill. So that is one of the biggest issues I deal with, because I deal with a lot of investors that buy properties that were probate or heirship properties. And I even had one client that, for whatever reason, she went and closed with another title company. When she bought it, she was an investor, she bought it. The title agent there didn't handle it correctly. Then, because the title agent, in that situation, it's up to the title agent to recognize the issue and to go and find out what the amount of taxes should be before closing and collect them. So that didn't get done. So then my client went and improved the property, rehabbed it, then 9 months later got ready to sell it. Went to another title company other than me, which I'm again not sure exactly why, but anyway, went to another title company, and then they say, oh, well, you owe an additional $4,000 in taxes before you can sell it. So then she comes to me, and so I, at that point, as her attorney, had to make a claim on her title policy, which I did, and we got her money back, but it was not easy. So that's a big issue. The other issues that can come up on taxes is if you buy a house, I believe, like you just did, you bought a house that was just recently built. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Right. So the tax value possibly for the prior year was just the lot value. But then now that the house is built, the tax value is a lot higher. Now that comes to play in connection with prorating the taxes. If it's the first 9 months of the year, we don't know what the current taxes for that year are going to be until October. So we just have to go by what the taxes were for the prior year. Well, they were artificially low because it was only based upon lot value. So if you prorate just on that number, then the buyer, take a hit, okay, from the proration. And then the last thing that taxes can really bite you is more on a commercial type transaction where the sellers have owned it for a number of years and have what's called an agricultural exemption. And that really, that exemption is fantastic if you can get it, because you really are paying practically nothing until the property the usage is changed. Well, so someone comes in, a commercial buyer comes in, buys the property, and then the usage changed. And again, the tax jurisdictions it's not immediate, but they get around to sending you a bill, and they can go up to 5 years prior at the full value. Okay, so those are things you just have to make sure that you know who you're dealing with as far as your settlement agent, that they really know what they're doing, or it can really come back to really bite you.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. That's one of the, like I said, that's why that's the number one claim that title insurance companies pay out is relating to taxes.
Right. Well, what would you say to us about homeowner associations?
Well, okay, homeowners associations, anyone that is buying a piece of property that has been developed since about the 1980s will probably be subject to restrictions imposed by a homeowners association. And, my house, I bought it was developed in the 1950s, and there was no such thing as homeowners associations. So I never had to worry about that. But a homeowners association, first thing is there's a declaration of restrictive covenants placed on the property, all the properties within the subdivision. And everyone that buys a property in there subsequent to the time of it being developed has to abide by those restrictions. Second of all, they do charge dues, and some are smaller, annual, some are monthly. And so the title company is charged with finding out the information about the homeowners association. And then the homeowners association will send what's called a resale certificate. And that's something that a buyer should definitely look at. Usually, sometimes they don't ever even get to look at it, depending on the title agent closing it. But really, they should ask for a copy of it before the closing so they can look at it. Rather than just trusting that it's all the way it's supposed to be. A resale certificate will show you what outstanding dues are due to the homeowners association, but more importantly to a buyer, it will show them if there are any existing violations of the HOA rules. I was involved in a closing where there was a violation, and it related to paint on the house. And nobody, I wasn't the closing agent. I was, I believe, the attorney for one of the parties, but nobody had looked at that prior to the closing. And so it wasn't really addressed. So then after the closing, there was an argument between the buyer and the seller as to who was going to pay for that painting that was required. Okay. The other thing is you need to read the restrictions. Now they're about 100 odd pages long. But really, I recommend to anyone that's new to this situation that they get a copy of it in advance and read it before closing, because sometimes the restrictions are not, acceptable to the buyer. For instance, I know of a situation where up in the northern part of the Metroplex, new area, a buyer that owned one of those big Ford F-150 4-door super cab trucks, bought a property in a HOA area. Well, that truck would not fit in their garage. So where were they going to have to keep it? Out in the driveway. Well, so that's what they were doing. And a few weeks after closing, they get a knock on the door from the HOA representative that they can't have that parked out there. That's against their restrictions to have a vehicle like that visible from the street. So, the ultimate resolution of that was that the buyer sold the house because they love their truck more than they love their house. But those are the kind of things you have to be aware of, that could come back to bite you.
Oh, that's a lot as well. How does a purchaser know they are protected once the closing has occurred?
Okay, so the closing, everything's been done, the money's been paid, the deed has been given to the buyer, the mortgage has been signed and recorded. Then about 6 weeks following closing, the buyer should receive in the mail a document entitled Owner Policy of Title Insurance. And that is a very important document. And unfortunately, because it comes after the closing where they got all their papers together at the closing and they may have those saved, in one place. But a lot of times this trailing document of the policy, they don't necessarily keep track of that. But that is technically an insurance policy, so that if they ever have any issue regarding the title to their house, say for instance, anytime after the closing, somebody comes back and says, oh, the deed that your seller, where they received the property, that was a forgery. And that has happened. That has happened multiple times. It results in a complete failure of title. And if that happens, then you, the buyer, don't own your house. And you definitely want to claim for what the amount of the title policy is. So, but you need your policy in order to make that claim. I also had been, I think a lot of people in DFW might remember that at one time, just a few years ago, there was a situation where a person came to closing, signed all the documents, and come to find out they were posing as the seller. In actuality, they had killed the seller and buried him in the backyard. And then my client, and actually my client was involved in that. He bought the property from another investor, and when he went to rehab the property, they noticed this thing in the backyard and come to find out. And then when it all came out, the guy had forged the documents and had provided a fake ID. So those kind of things, even though they're not every deal, but if they happen, they are major.
No kidding.
So you really have to keep track of that title policy. And if you don't know what to do when something like that happens, consult an attorney, and they can walk you through making your claim on your title policy.
Gaylene, this is invaluable information for buyers, whether they purchase for themselves or are in the business
Correct.
of real estate investing.
Correct.
So
a lot of these examples I just gave you, some of them were home buyers, some were first-time home buyers, some were seasoned investors.
sure,
It doesn't really make a
Right.
difference.
right.
These
Right.
are things that have to be paid attention to, or there's going to be a problem.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think this was very helpful for anyone who's watching this.
All right, fantastic. Well, join us next time, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you.